And welcome to another episode of A Little Privacy, Please. My name is Jason Kravitz, and as always, with me is Jenny Holmes, who co-leads the Nixon Peabody cybersecurity and privacy team, as well as co-hosts this video podcast with me. Jenny, we've had a lot of great fortune. We've had a lot of wonderful guests over the 2 or 3 years we've been doing this, but today is a really special one for us. So today's guest is Professor Marianne Franks from the George Washington University Law School. She is an absolute bona fide star in the privacy and cybersecurity world. Professor Franks is also the president and legislative and tech policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is a fantastic organization. We're going to get into some of the details about that later. She's also the author of a couple of books, including this one called Fearless Speech, which just published, I think, in the last few months. And Jenny, what did you think of the book?
I mean, I'm not just saying this because she's staring right at me, but I loved this book. I think it captured a lot of the uneasiness that we feel with the First Amendment, especially given what's going on in the world right now, as well as just a great history of the First Amendment, how it's been challenged, how it's been implemented in practice. I loved it.
Yeah, I did too. I am a history buff, and I do love the fact that she takes us through, hundreds of years of history of the history of the First Amendment and this concept of fearless speech. I think it's actually also eerily relevant today in our current political environment, and I know we're going to start to talk a little bit about that as we dive in. Why don't we just start by maybe asking you what the significance of the title is for fearless speech, where that comes from?
So this actually goes back quite a few years. I think it was 2018. I was still working on the final touches for my first book, The Cult of the Constitution. And I was sort of really in the weeds with free speech scholarship and stories. And I was giving a talk out in UNC Charlotte, and I was having a conversation with my host, Gordon Hull, the philosopher, and talking about some of my frustrations about the freedom of speech doctrine and the kinds of things I wanted to emphasize that didn't seem to be captured by the doctrine, or that the doctrine seemed to distort in some ways. And he said to me, do you know about this concept, the ancient Greek concept called parrhesia? And I was actually a classics minor when I was an undergrad, so my little nerd ears perked up, and I thought, oh, no, tell me more. I want to know more about this. And he said it was what, the ancient Greeks thought speech was obviously essential to democracy, but they had this very specific conception of it. They had multiple conceptions of it, but one of them was parrhesia, which he said, the French philosopher Michel Foucault was really taken with this concept and did a whole series of lectures in the 1980s at Berkeley about this concept. And the way that he thought it should be translated was not free speech, but fearless speech. And he traces in his lectures the contours of what he thinks the Greeks were getting at when they said this is the kind of speech that's actually essential to democracy. It's not just free speech. It's not just say what you want. Everybody can say anything they would like. It's a very specific kind of citizenship action that is specifically about being candid, that is taking your own position and making sure that people understand this is coming from you. It's not some position you're adopting for performance sakes. So you're candidly taking on this position, and you are speaking to someone or something that is more powerful than you are. So you have to be addressing something that has more power than you have, or some person that has more power. So you have to be speaking in that concept of criticizing this person who's in power. It's not when you flatter them. It's not when you compliment them for the great job they're doing. It's when you're being critical. And because you're being critical of someone who has more power than you are necessarily having to be courageous, fearless, because they have the power to hurt you, maybe up into the point of having you killed. So that concept of speech really is so different, I thought, from the concept that we normally think of in the United States, that is so bound up with the concept of the First Amendment and this sort of rough understanding that maybe free speech is just say whatever you want with no consequences, whereas this was such a more interesting and rich kind of way of looking at the privilege, right, of speaking and the gift of speaking. And that's what I decided I really wanted to be the title of the book, and the approach that I wanted to take to thinking about these questions.
And I love the title. So what really motivated you to write this book? I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about it right now, given everything that's going on. But obviously you started researching and looking into this, long time ago. So what really was the push for that?
It really does go back to that first book that I wrote, which was a critique, not just of the First Amendment, but the Second Amendment as well. And not a critique so much of the laws themselves or the amendments themselves, but of what I called the kind of approach of constitutional fundamentalism. And I compared that in my first book to religious fundamentalism. I was raised in a religious fundamentalist community, and sort of try to draw out the connections between the way that people can take any scripture, let's take, the Bible, or we can take the Constitution and read it in ways that are extremely selective and very self-serving. And the people who do that, they tend to tell the rest of the world, this is how things must be. It's not just that this is how I would like the scripture to be written or to be interpreted. This is how it must be. And if you disagree, you're not just wrong, you're a heretic, or you are someone outside of the community. And the more I studied the First and Second Amendments, the more I thought that's really the way that so many people approach those amendments. They take those concepts and they read them in ways that are highly selective and always happen somehow to serve the best interests of the people like themselves. And there's this anger around it too, this extremism, the sense of, you are on the outside or you are on the inside. And so that book was really dwelling on all the limitations of looking at the Constitution this way and how bad it was for us as a society and how it was going to undermine our democracy instead of strengthen it. And what I wanted to do, though, in addition to talking about the things that I thought were wrong, I wanted to talk about all the things that are good and right and inspirational about speech. And so the real motivation, I think, for the book was to tell the stories that were not First Amendment stories, really, because to understand, where I was coming from, it always seemed like the First Amendment got in the way of some of the best conversations we could have about speech. We would talk about something interesting or controversial, and then suddenly it would be a conversation about, well, that's protected, or that shouldn't be protected, or which may or may not be true, may or may not be good, but is such a limited way of looking at something as rich and varied as speech could be. So what I really wanted to do was to talk about examples of free speech, of people who had spoken out in just the ways that I described, that Foucault sort of highlighted for us in the ancient Greek concept of parousia, people who really put everything on the line to say something true, usually in service of equality or in service of trying to name injustice or speak out against injustice. And I realized that the most interesting of those stories weren't really the stories that are captured by the First Amendment or First Amendment cases. They were all the stories that are partly known in history, but not really as speech stories, not really as fearless speech stories. And really the motivation for the book was to celebrate that and to have that open our minds a little bit beyond whatever the legal doctrine might be, to think about what is truly radical, revolutionary, liberating about the powers of speech.
Professor Franks, one of the things you spent a lot of time talking about in the book is kind of pointing out that there's a lot of misconception about what the First Amendment really is and what it protects. And you dispel some of those misperceptions. I was wondering if you could just spend a little bit of time telling the audience about that.
It's an interesting thing, I think, for most people who are raised or spend a lot of time in the United States. I think we have this almost reflexive sense that we all understand what the First Amendment says and does. And that would be wonderful if it were true, right? Because the First Amendment does belong to all of us, and it is really important and really powerful. And it would be good if we all thought of it as something that we understand on this intuitive level. But as anybody who spent any amount of time on First Amendment case law can certainly attest, it's not at all straightforward. It's an incredibly complicated, at times completely contradictory doctrine. For the first 100 years of the United States, it basically didn't do anything at all. And then when it was invoked, finally at the turn of the century, from the switch over from the 1800s to the 1900s, pretty much all the famous cases where people were raising First Amendment as their defense, they lost, over and over and over again. So we have this perception, I think the kind of rough kind of perception of the First Amendment is, oh, it protects our right to say what we want to say and nobody can stop us. And then I think, especially in the kind of digital age, that's also become, I can say I have a right to a platform. So it's not just that the government can't punish me for what I say. That part's pretty true, used to be true until fairly recently. But the other part of thinking that you have a right to people's attention, right? That you are supposed to be given opportunities to speak. That is, if someone tries to block you on social media, that somehow that's censorship of you. Those are ideas that we'd never really seen before, but became really popular over the last few years. So it seemed like people were having this very strange perception about what the First Amendment protected, and they were mixing up government action and private action. They were mixing up the ability not to be punished for your speech with the idea to have an affirmative right to have your speech promoted. And so those are the kinds of things I really wanted to separate before we started talking about all the ways in which even accurately understood First Amendment doctrine is limiting and maybe contradictory and problematic. There are some things that are fairly straightforward that we should clear up, and the biggest one being, it's really just about what the government can't do to you for your speech, primarily in the sense that they can't just punish you because they don't like what you're saying. It doesn't mean the government can't regulate a whole bunch of other speech. It doesn't mean that they can choose to highlight other people's speech rather than yours. And it certainly doesn't mean that non-governmental actors don't have the ability to make their own choices about what they want to listen to and what they want to promote. So I'm really trying to correct some of those misunderstandings.
It feels like the story of Sophie Scholl really had a profound impact on you, and it did on me as well. I would love it if you could share that story with our audience.
I couldn't honestly believe when I learned about her story that I hadn't learned about it before, that this wasn't something I'd come across until, I guess it was maybe a few years ago, a few years before I wrote this book. I was reading about, I've actually done a lot of reading about Nazi Germany and about the use of propaganda to dehumanize populations and how, what we really need to learn from history. There's an important lesson for us to learn there. I've spent a lot of time on that topic. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I came across the story of Sophie Scholl, who was one of the members of the White Rose resistance movement, which was a student group in 1942 and 1943 in Germany. Pretty small group, mostly students, a few professors, who had decided that they would try to tell the truth to the German population about what the Nazis were actually doing, because the Nazis were lying a lot to their own people. And they really wanted this small group got it in their minds that they wanted to spread the truth to the population so that they would rise up and resist what was happening in their name. And Sophie Scholl at the time, in 1943, she is 21 years old, so she's quite young. She and her brother are from this middle-class German family. They're quite privileged. I believe she was a member, they were both members of the Hitler Youth groups when they were young, because most Germans were. And then they go to college and they realize terrible things are happening and that their government is doing terrible things. And so they're distributing these pamphlets in various places. And she and her brother Hans are distributing these pamphlets at University of Munich, which is where they were both students. And on this day, they were tossing some of these pamphlets over this balcony, and they got caught. There was a custodian that observed them, and the custodian was a member of the Nazi Party, and he reports them. And they're very quickly apprehended, and they're kept in interrogation for several days. And Sophie is told, if you just turn on your brother and say that he was the one who did all of this, then we'll be lenient with you. And she refuses to do that. And they have this kind of show trial because there wasn't really due process at that time. And the judge didn't let them speak in their own defense. The accusations were made against them to say that they had done these illegal things by speaking out against the German government. And even though they're not allowed to speak, Sophie interrupts the judge multiple times to say, we had to make a start. We had to do something. And she's told that she has to be quiet. And at the end of the trial that day, they're all condemned to the guillotine. And the moments that we know about before her march to her death are recorded or given to us by her cellmate, who tells us that what Sophie says on her way out is, she comments on how beautiful the day is. And she says, I have to go. And she says, but what does my death matter if, because of our words, people rise up and they resist? And every time I think about a 21-year-old girl who has put literally everything on the line, is facing down death, and has no regrets about it because she says, I have done the right thing. And because of the things that we have said, other people are going to do the right thing. Not only was this just an incredibly moving, powerful example of fearless speech, of parousia, it was such a stark contrast to the high watermarks that we think of as First Amendment cases, right? The most ringing endorsements of the First Amendment cases that I was studying at that same moment, which included the neo-Nazi march in Skokie, Illinois in the 1970s. This is when a bunch of neo-Nazis want to dress up like they are Nazi officers and they want to have these swastikas and these armbands, and they want to march through a town that is full of Holocaust survivors and their families, and they want to terrorize them. And the ACLU defends them, even though Skokie, the town, doesn't want them there. And that's often cited as, oh, this is the brave, principled tradition of the First Amendment. See how tolerant we are. And there may be good arguments for why we need to have that kind of tolerance or not, but just the idea that the concept of speech could be articulated through an example like a neo-Nazi trying to terrify a Holocaust survivor, or you could have an example like Sophie Scholl's. And I thought, why isn't Sophie Scholl's example the one that we are celebrating and know better than any other story?
Let's just shift gears though to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is for those of us who practice in this space, that is a very big deal for any internet sort of social media platform and publisher, if you will, of content. And in your book, you spend some time not only pointing out the obvious limitations of Section 230 and the way it's been sort of misinterpreted in your view, but also you offer some suggestions for fixing it. Can you share some of that with us?
Section 230 says, in essence, if you are a platform for speech online, and you are, let's say, like a social media platform, a Facebook or an Instagram, and that means that you have users who are posting their speech on your platform, and those users post things that are illegal or defamatory or somehow harmful. See, there are two sections of Section 230, one of which says essentially, or has been interpreted to mean, you can't be held responsible for that. That is, you can't be sued for those things that the users say. And then there's this other part of Section 230, which is the second provision that says, if you take measures as a platform to try to avoid horrible content or just offensive content or anything that you just don't want on your platform, and you take it down because you're trying to provide a different kind of experience for your users or for your community, that you can't be sued for that either. So they're almost in some ways sort of inverses of each other. For one, the kinds of things you leave up and even promote, you can't be held accountable for. And on the other hand, if you take things down, you can't be held accountable for that either. Now, my view on Section 230 is that the most important thing for us to do is to stop talking about Section 230 as if it were one thing as opposed to those two things, because those two things are very, very different. The second one, in my view, is very justifiable because it's essentially just the First Amendment restated. If you are a private actor, you're not the state, you're not the government, you have every right to say, I don't want to talk to you, or I don't want to promote your speech, I don't want to publish your op-ed, I don't want to listen to you talk to me in the street, right? So the idea that people can't sue you over that makes sense. It's a procedural protection on top of your First Amendment protected right to say, I want to promote this speech and not this speech over here. That seems really reasonable. The first provision, though, could be interpreted in ways that are quite reasonable, but have been interpreted in a really, really wide, it's been given a lot of discretion and essentially has been used to say, even if the platform is fully aware of how harmful the content is, and even it's deliberately choosing to solicit that content and to put it prominently, make sure that people see it more than they see other kinds of content. And even if the platform is literally making money off of exactly that kind of harmful content, they still have no obligation to take it down. They can't be sued for it. And that I have suggested, along with others like Professor Danielle Citron, who I know you've had on the show, this is a very, very bad thing because it is not something, we have never seen anything like that before in terms of a immunity regime for any other industry, really. Certainly not any other industry that operates in the realm of speech. You think about how newspapers can get sued for defamation. You think about how if a bookseller has a book that has unlawful content in it, and they are told, hey, you have this book that you're selling in your bookstore that is unlawful and you have to take it out, they can all be sued. But this one industry that is incredibly powerful is told, well, you can do whatever you want, no matter how harmful it is, and no matter how much harm actually flows from your actions in promoting it, you are protected. And I'm very concerned not only about the fact that that means people cannot sue the way that they normally could sue if this were offline speech, but also about the incentives that it creates for platforms to maximize the most harmful content possible because they have no reason not to. The New York Times has some incentive not to publish wildly irresponsible speech because they know there's a chance that they could be sued over it. your online component, right? Your online newsletter, your site that claims to be whatever it is, social media platform, news platform, doesn't have the same obligations and can just maximize really harmful content and pocket the money from it, and can be absolutely assured that they won't ever face any responsibility for it. That seems really wrong, and I think it needs to be changed.
Separate from your book, you are very involved in an organization called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, along with our good friend, Professor Danielle Citron from UVA Law, who happened to be a guest on our show last year. Could you just spend a few minutes telling us about the initiative and its mission?
Yes. So the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative our name comes from Danielle Citron's article that she wrote. I forget which year it was, but it was titled Cyber Civil Rights. And we began in 2013 as when we became we got our legal status as a nonprofit, but we were begun by a victim of non-consensual pornography, whose name is Holly Jacobs, Dr. Holly Jacobs, who had this experience in Florida and was trying to figure out ways to fight back. So this was at a time, I think the first time it happened to her was 2010, 2011. And these really intimate photos of her that she had shared with a partner that, she didn't expect anybody else to see. When this relationship ended, these pictures start ending up everywhere, and they start to affect every aspect of her life. She's a graduate student who's trying to teach classes and to finish her dissertation and to publish articles. And now these photos, these incredibly intimate images, are everywhere online under her name. And she spends weeks and weeks and weeks trying to plead with these sites to say, please take these things down. These are invasions of my privacy. I never consented to give these photos to anybody. And it got so bad that no matter how many times that she tried to get people to hear her story and to take the images down, they would always end up on hundreds more sites. And she eventually ended up changing her name because she couldn't get away from the attachment of these images and what was being said about her. And she tried to go to lawyers. She tried to go to the police. She tried to go to everyone she could think of to get help with what was happening to her. And she kept being told the same thing, which was, what's happening to you isn't a crime. It's not against the law. And this was an accurate statement at the time that it was made in 2011, 2012, 2013 in Florida. At that time, there were only 3 states that had any provisions that prohibited conduct like that. And so she found me, Dr. Jacobs found me through a law review article I had written about revenge porn and other forms of online abuse. And she came and she told me her story. And I remember asking her, I'm horrified by your story. I'm so sorry this has happened, but I don't know how I can be of help to you. And she said to me, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any legal training. I have been told by all the people who know the law that this isn't against the law. And if that is true, then the law should change, and I need you to help me change it. And that was that. And so I immediately called Danielle. We called a few other people that we knew. We founded this organization together, and we were dedicating ourselves to trying to stop these forms of online abuses, especially the exploitation of people's privacy and their private images. And we've done that through model legislation and working with tech companies to be more responsible and to try to raise an awareness about this issue more generally and to set up a victim support helpline. And now, as of today, we have 49 states as opposed to 3 states that have non-consensual distribution of intimate imagery laws. And we've had multiple attempts at a federal law, and we may finally get one eventually, but we're still working on that.
I know, Jenny, and I want to point out that it's a wonderful organization, obviously doing fantastic things. K&L Gates deserves a lot of credit. They've been working with you for, I think, almost 10 years now on that. And Nixon Peabody recently has thrown our hat in the ring, and we're going to be joining that effort too and supporting K&L Gates in the organization and trying to do some good. So thanks for letting us do that and join your efforts.
There are a lot of times when I was reading that I found myself shaking my head or, rubbing my head, pulling my hair out. How do you relax? How do you turn that off and just unwind?
I don't know if I can say that I ever turn it off, but I do allow myself to watch a lot of TV. and so I will lose myself in Severance, and not that is necessarily comforting, but yes, I definitely let myself try to explore other worlds that are not worlds that I have responsibility for. So I continue, I always have since I was a kid, have always taken refuge in literature. So, and that's everything from highbrow literature to extremely lowbrow literature. And so whatever it is, if I find myself just overwhelmed with what is happening around me, I tell myself you can take a break and you can read a book and transport yourself to some other place and some other time for a little while.
What's your favorite lowbrow show that you're streaming right now?
Favorite lowbrow. I don't know if this counts as lowbrow, but I've just started watching Residence. I don't think it's lowbrow. I think it's incredibly clever and interesting, and I love murder mysteries, and so it's just a lot of fun, and I've been really enjoying that.
That's going to do it for this episode. Professor Franks, thank you so much. And to our viewers, I cannot recommend her book enough. It is timely, it is passionate, it is important. So please read it. Thank you.